Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining the Sierra Club Iowa chapter's weekly Lunch and Learn. Every Friday at noon, we go live with an environmentally focused topic, bringing in experts and advocates to share their knowledge and insights. Today, we are excited to welcome Arjun Makhijani, a PhD from the Electrical Engineering Department from the University of California, Berkeley, where he specialized in nuclear fusion. He is the president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. He has spent decades analyzing the safety, economics, and efficiency of energy systems. And today's presentation will focus on tritium, a radioactive form of hydrogen produced in nuclear reactors and used in nuclear weapons. Tritium is the focus of his most recent book, Exploring Tritium Dangers, published in 2023, which examines the health and environmental risks associated with tritium exposure. We're grateful to have him with us today to help us unpack this important and timely topic. So with that, I will hand it on over to you, Arjun.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. All right. Can you all see that? That should be in presentation mode. I'm trying to get in
Yes.
presentation mode. Um, I just did. Oh, there we go. All right. Thank you for inviting me. I've been to your state a number of times. I'm going to talk about the first element in the periodic table, hydrogen. It has three isotopes. Isotopes mean the same number of protons, same chemical properties, but different atomic mass. So uh, hydrogen 1 is your normal hydrogen H in the H2O. Deuterium is hydrogen 2, not radioactive. It's present in seawater naturally, about 1 part in 1,000, if I'm remembering the number correctly. And hydrogen 3 does occur in nature in trace quantities. I'll tell you how, but in very trace quantities, in reactions that occur in the atmosphere from cosmic rays. And it is radioactive. It's actually very radioactive. So, but since they all have the same chemical properties, you can have water that's H2O, or you can have water that is D2O or DHO, one deuterium, one hydrogen, or HTO, one hydrogen, one tritium, or T2O. Now, whenever you have tritium in water, it's radioactive. So you have radioactive water, and water, of course, is the stuff of life. And once it gets in, your cellular system and your body does not know it is radioactive, goes all over until, of course, it decays and damages things. Okay, so HTO or T is the normal symbol for hydrogen. Also, for tritium, it's also written H-3, 3 standing for atomic mass. That would be a technical way of writing it. Only 100 to 200 grams are created each year. Um, that's 100 grams, about a fourth of a pound, a little less. And created during nuclear bomb explosions and nuclear reactors. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. It's a relatively low energy radioactive decay, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that too. Beta decay, a beta particle that it emits is an electron. It is very radioactive. How radioactive? So a little bit about tritium's radioactivity. So it's a beta particle, it's an electron. It's not very high energy. So when it hits something like the dead layer of the skin, it doesn't go through. But if it deposits on the skin as as water vapor depositing on the skin, it can be absorbed into the body. So then it's inside the body. You can breathe it, and of course you can drink it, and you can get it in food in the form when it's organically bound. Of course, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, they're the main constituents of our biology and carbon. So, we're 60% water as adults. Fetuses are more, they have more water and are impacted more. I'll talk about that. And of course, hydrogen can combine with organic molecules. Glucose is um, an organic molecule, makes the brain run. Um, so then it becomes part of the food. As tritium gas, it's very low risk because you breathe it in and breathe it out. It's not absorbed in the body easily. So then its radiation dangers are, until it oxidizes in the atmosphere and becomes water vapor or deposits in a body of water. So, how radioactive is tritium? A teaspoon of HTO, pure HTO. So, only one of the atoms of hydrogen would be tritium, the other would be ordinary hydrogen, can contaminate over 600 million gallons of water to the US drinking water limit. So, how is it made in the atmosphere and similar in anthropogenic processes can be made in accelerators or it can be made in reactors. And it is made in by that right-hand process reactor striking lithium-6 in the Watts bar reactor of TVA. And that's how tritium is produced for nuclear weapons currently in a civilian reactor, actually, and has been for some time, I think since the 1990s. Tritium also made during nuclear weapons testing. So you can see the natural tritium kind of is very low, very small, close to zero on this scale, and very giant spikes as a result of nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere. And of course, United States and Soviet Union were the main ones, but also France, Britain, and China. Those are the countries that have tested in the atmosphere. So I've talked about this hydrogen isotope. So this is basically an overview of tritium, where it comes from and where it goes. Um, so when neutrons react with the atmosphere in the same way as natural cosmic ray neutron in the atmosphere, but because there are so many neutrons created in the course of nuclear weapons explosions in the atmosphere, a lot of tritium is created. That's why you see that spike, and especially from hydrogen bomb explosions, very powerful bombs, so lots and lots of neutrons, and fusion neutrons. So fusion produces energetic neutrons. Nuclear fission reactors produce it in the course of their operation. Boiling water reactors less because they don't produce it in the reactor water because normally there's not boron in the reactor water. But it's produced in spent fuel pools. So the longer the spent fuel pool sits in the spent fuel pools, you will get tritium. And quite a lot of the tritium emissions currently are from spent fuel pools because so much spent fuel is accumulated in those pools. And if, I'm sort of being technical in the sense of assuming you're familiar with nuclear reactors to some extent. And so an important note, since there's so much talk about nuclear fusion for power, most of the power approaches for nuclear fusion are deuterium, tritium, same as in the primaries of nuclear weapons. The deuterium, the tritium that's produced is for bottles that contain deuterium and tritium to make the primary explosion more powerful and efficient. And so if you have nuclear fusion from the deuterium tritium approach, you can expect they tell you it's going to be clean or radioactivity, but there will be tritium involved. So these are the tritium airborne emissions. So there's water vapor. So all reactors rain radioactive rain on their neighbors, all of them, as a course of operation, but variable how much. Pressurized water reactors somewhat more than boiling water reactors. And so this shows you the 75 percentile median and 25 percentile value for a number of years. These are data from the effluent reports that reactor operators make with the NRC. I guess this source is different. So, but these are all compiled from reactor operator reports. So this gives you a range, so there's a wide variability among nuclear power plants. Of course, some nuclear power plants have more than one reactor and some just one, like UN Arnold. So that is part of the reason, but the main reason is operational matters and whether it's a BWR or boiling water or pressurized water reactor. So you can see it can be 0 to 10. So generally the reactors on the left, 10 to 15 reactors will emit between 0 and 60 curies a year. And then there are some reactors that emit a lot, 60, 80, 100, 300 to 1,000. And one reactor that was more than 1,000. I don't give the year. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I don't have the year. This is Duane Arnold. This is from the 2019 effluent report, gaseous emissions. So you can see the other gas. I think these numbers are, they're measured by the reactor operators. They're the only numbers we have. I generally accept them. I have some questions about when the measurements are taken, especially for tritium. But this can give you an order of magnitude idea of what's going on and generally useful numbers, in my opinion. So you can see tritium is the blue squares at the top, by far the largest, except for noble gases. Noble gases are like krypton and xenon. So they're a lot like you breathe them in and you breathe them out, low risk. Of course, some noble gases decay into solid radioactive products, but their radioactivity generally goes down from the level of the noble gas, which is the originator of the decay product. And so overall, tritium is orders of magnitude. Now, carbon 14 is a similar order of magnitude. So this chart doesn't show carbon 14. And of course, carbon is also the stuff of life. But carbon 14 gets into the atmosphere as carbon 14 dioxide and then becomes part of the food chain because, that's the basis of plant photosynthesis. And so tritium was 29 curies in 2019 for Duane Arnold. Carbon 14 was 10 curies. So similar order of magnitude, it's 3 times less. So this gives you an idea. So the boiling water reactors are at the left. So generally less emission. This is a log scale. So this is 100, 10, 1E2 is 100, 1E3 is 1,000. So you can see these boiling water reactors up to Pilgrim are generally in the hundreds of curies per year. Pilgrim was very low in 2002. Was it shut already? I don't think it was. I don't know I don't remember when Pilgrim shut, but I think it was operating in 2002. Duane Arnold in 2019 was down here, less than one. So very low tritium emissions to the air. Less than one to the water. I'm sorry. I told you 29 curies to the air. These are water releases. Sorry about that error. So what about the risks? What are we talking about? So radiation protection generally has focused on cancer risk. So when you see radiation protection standards, 100 millirem per year for the general public, NRC standard, 25 millirem per year, the EPA standard for nuclear fuel cycle facilities, including power plants. Now that's to the whole body or to any organ except the thyroid, which is 75 millirem. It's cancer risk. But cancer risk focuses on, damage to the nuclear DNA. Most damage to the nuclear DNA is repaired naturally. The kind of genetic damage to the nuclear DNA that's kind of problematic is like double strand breaks, where each strand has to find the other end and repair itself accurately. So the risk of misrepair is high in double stand breaks. And, DNA damage occurs naturally in the course, not only in the course of just living and aging, but in the course of simply, metabolism. And so nuclear DNA repair is a normal biological phenomenon, not only in us, but in other animals that have nuclei. But mitochondrial DNA is not in the nucleus of the cell. It is in the cytoplasm. I'll show you a chart. Let me see here. So here, this is a chart of a cell. And so this is the nucleus. And the mitochondria are here, like this number 9. And there are hundreds to upwards of 1,000 in each human cell, varying according to the type of cell. And this is the energy production system of the body. It is also the communication system of the cell between the environment and the nucleus. So there's a lot of communication between mitochondria and the nucleus. These are other organelles. So the cell is actually very complicated, but mitochondria are remnants of bacteria. They are remnants of bacteria. So they're not a complete organism anymore. They're a piece of an organism, but they have their own DNA. It's a relatively simple DNA. It's a circular DNA. And because it's relatively simple and a remnant of an organism, its repair mechanisms are pretty deficient. So when you damage the mitochondria, you're damaging the energy system of the body and you're damaging the communication system of the body between the environment and the nucleus. So it's a very, very serious thing. Now, when tritium gets in, most of the cell is water. And so tritium will ionize water. Each tritium decay on average can ionize hundreds of molecules of water, split them apart. And when you have ions, some of the ions will become hydroxyl radicals, very reactive, and can cause a lot of damage. That's one of the main mechanisms of damage inside the cell, including mitochondrial DNA damage. And there's a whole class of diseases called mitochondrial diseases. Now, tritium has not been treated with respect as a radionuclide. That's why I wrote a whole book about it, because radiation protection is focused on cancer risk and for a long time on adults. And enforcement of the Clean Air Act to this day, although it says limit doses, and I'll come back to this at the end, but I want to tell you now so you can kind of keep this in mind as we go through. The EPA is supposed to protect, quote, any member of the public. The dose should be limited to any member of the public. But in practice, they limit that definition to adults legally. So from a point of view of radiation enforcement, children and infants are not people. And we tested this recently at Los Alamos, where they were going to emit tritium. They did emit some tritium to the atmosphere from waste containers. And they refused to do their compliance calculation, and the EPA allowed them to do it compliance only for adults. Now, we're talking about post-birth, but there's also pregnancy risk. There is no regulation for all the talk. There is no regulation protecting the embryo and the fetus or pregnant women members of the public. None. And, this is a small part of the list of radionuclides that cross the placenta, not only during pregnancy, if the intakes are during pregnancy, but if the intake is prior to pregnancy and the radionuclide is still in the body, it will cross the placenta. And this gives you some of the ratios of how the concentration in the fetus to the concentration in the mother. And actually, this is a snapshot in time in terms of ratios. And like iodine, for instance, iodine 131, which is not shown here, crosses the placenta. And its variation, actually, the amount in the fetus, the ratio in the fetus to the mother increases with as the pregnancy progresses. So it's not a static number. That is a snapshot. These are pretty much official data. I don't do original um, health physics research, so the data I'm giving you are generally from official sources. So once tritium is emitted, this is how it gets to you. Because it's water, it becomes, even it's emitted as a gas, it will oxidize in the atmosphere. It'll become water vapor. It'll come down as rain. And then, of course, once it is in rain, it's in plants and cattle can eat it. It's in water bodies. And it decays with a half-life of 12.3 years. So most of the tritium, the vast majority of the tritium from nuclear testing has decayed. So most of the tritium now is the principal sources of tritium are from nuclear power plants. So you can see that tritium becomes organically bound. Becomes This is an official chart from the French Institute of Radioprotection Studies, a chart from one of their official publications. So there's a little summary of mitochondrial damage. My research focused a lot on mitochondrial damage. Now, mitochondria are inherited solely from the mother, and the mitochondria and the sperm are stripped out in the process of fertilization. So this is essentially a maternal inheritance. And so when a woman is pregnant, when the ova are formed, so you're creating risks during pregnancy and more risks for female fetuses than for male fetuses. Of course, there's risks to sperm. If men drink radioactive water, it can get into the sperm because sperm are made continuously. So it's not that reproductive risk on the side of males are zero. One of the reasons that tritium has been disrespected is because it has been a cancer risk thing and originated, nuclear weapons production, Manhattan Project, and after the 50s, basically. So there's a lot of tritium in the nuclear weapons complex and the principal pollutant from nuclear weapons production. And but basically, when people had intakes of tritium, because it is water in the body, people were told drink a lot of water, drink a lot of coffee. Uh, you know, Here's a six pack of beer. If you then you will urinate more and it'll be flushed out of your body faster. And that is true. That it will be flushed out of your body. And if you flush it out rapidly enough, of course, that reduces the doses because only ionizing inside the body matters in terms of radiation dose and risk. But that is not the case with infants because, the question of repair is different. The question of mitochondrial damage is different, and even more so with embryonic and fetal exposure. If you're regulating the cancer risk, you're not regulating to many other risks. So here are some of them. Early failed pregnancies. Now, Brianna, I'll go for another 10, 12 minutes. Is that all right?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah. So early failed pregnancies, what does that mean? It can mean several different things. It may mean once fertilized, the fertilized egg fails to develop an implant. After implantation, that can be a miscarriage. So early miscarriages. So that's what I generally call it as early failed pregnancies. And there's a question of what dose it takes, but there's no question that early failed pregnancies can result from radiation exposure during early pregnancy. And there's some controversy about how much radiation it takes. But as I've said, certain kinds of radiation exposure are not, and I'll get to that. So there's malformations. That is primarily during the period of organ formation. So most organs are formed in the first trimester of pregnancy, within a few week period. However, the brain, from 3, 4 weeks, the nervous system begins to form, and then brain formation goes on throughout pregnancy pretty much. And in early infancy for the first 3 years. The brain is still physically growing in mass. And of course, there are neuronal connections. And you can have severe neurological damage. Severe neurological damage was found in, so there were pregnant women at the time of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, of course, in 1945. And some of those women survived, and some of them survived enough to give birth to their babies. Their babies survived. And so the study of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors did not begin until 1950 officially. There are some other data that indicate pretty severe effects, but they're not part of the official epidemiological study. It's a very big problem. I have just finished a report on reproductive aspects of radiation exposure. It'll be published in the next month or two, and it will be on our website. Brianna, I'll send it to you and you can circulate it. But this is a pretty serious problem. Severe mental retardation, as defined here, individual unable to form simple sentences, solve simple problems. This is in the International Commission on Radiological Protection report. The reference is in my Tritium book. You'll find all of this stuff pretty much in my Tritium book with footnotes. And they found an excess of this in the 1980s when they analyzed the data with no threshold, means small exposure, small risk, big exposure, bigger risk, and proportional. Later on, that was revised by, um, it's hard to characterize it. Uh, Later on, the numbers were revised. Some were excluded, some two cases were excluded from the data, and they said, well, there was a severe mental retardation, but there's a threshold. So you don't need to worry about very low levels of exposure. In my opinion, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki data have not been used properly in this way for a number of reasons, and I go into that in detail in the report I just finished last year for the Nuclear Truth Project that'll be published soon. But a large part of the problem is many of the difficult pregnancies, many of the miscarriages, many of the problem pregnancies in the sense of, adverse outcomes were not included. And even in 1950, when the studies were started, they only took into account permanent residents of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but many people had moved. And they actually found cases of severe mental retardation among at least two children among those who had moved, but they're not part of the data. So there's a lot of problems in terms of study of reproductive risks, but there's no question that there are reproductive risks. There are a lot of controversies about when and how much and so on. And it's a very big problem, especially in light of the fact that we don't protect pregnant women members of the public. And then, of course, ova and sperm damage create multi-generational risk. Ova, of course, are formed only during pregnancy in the female fetus. And there are millions formed, only a few hundred are actually ever released. So Mother Nature has a way of controlling damage. So you don't see as much damage as you might expect because of that. And, miscarriages, I said early failed pregnancies. We don't exactly know how many early failed pregnancies normally occur that is outside of the context of radiation exposure. There are toxics in nature, there are environmental and genetic factors, but maybe 1 in 5 pregnancies end in early failure. A lot of uncertainty because most women think they're having a period and they may have a failed pregnancy before they know they're pregnant. And that's, one of the issues that has come up in public discussion recently in a different context. It's not only people, there are reproductive risks that have been documented in other creatures, fish eggs, and And one other, I don't have it down here. It's in one of my recent articles. We don't really regulate for reproductive protection of ecosystem for reproductive risk. There are examples of owls outside of Los Alamos or in Los Alamos in the waste area that have hundreds of times the drinking water standard that are supposed to be okay according to DOE guidelines. So we don't really have serious ecosystem protection, not only from tritium, but other. So as I've said, so to wrap up quickly, we're not taking pregnant members of the public into account. Cancer as an endpoint is very important, of course, and essential, but it's not the only endpoint. The risks for other endpoints are different. They can be higher or lower per unit of radiation. Certain kinds of internal radiation, the genetic damage, certain kinds of genetic damage is hundreds of times that of gamma radiation, not just 20 times, as we do for alpha particle internal radiation. Tritium behaves similarly to alpha particles in that it deposits its energy generally entirely within a cell, but it's much, much lower energy per decay. But then, it's also water, so it gets everywhere. So that is one of the main sources of my concern about tritium. It's water. It's the stuff of life. You're messing with the stuff of life. And so in terms of endpoints, certain genetic aberrations occur only with internal alpha radiation, but not external radiation. So this whole matter of non-cancer risks is very complicated. It's understudied and certainly under-regulated in terms of other endpoints. So we have a seriously deficient regulation system. And this not only applies to tritium, here are some of the other problem radionuclide. Iodine 131 certainly also creates reproductive risks. Carbon-14 has to basically, be taken up from the atmosphere and then incorporated biologically into your food. And so, has a more complicated path rather than just being drunk in as water absorbed from the skin. So we have other radionuclides other than tritium and carbon-14 are principally important in terms of atmospheric testing and severe nuclear accidents. I showed you that other radionuclide emissions are relatively small routinely, but that's routinely, not including accidents. Okay. I mentioned this that we are not protecting children in terms of enforcement, even though in my reading, and it's a technical reading, I've talked to lawyers about this. I must say, going to court and, saying that infants are members of the public according to legal definitions could be complicated, but, I'm not a lawyer. I, an infant is a person, you know, um, and in my simple reasoning, infants are members of the public. And it's the obligation of adults to protect them. They can't make decisions. Los Alamos, it should say here. I'm sorry. I'll correct that. Okay, recommendations. So finally, a wrap up here. We've been trying for 25 years to put the issue of radionuclides that cross more than 25 years on the map of regulation, national academies, EPA, but we have failed. And we have recommended that, 20,000 picocuries per liter from an adult radiation protection point of view gives you a very small dose, 1 millirem for an adult. And so, but it's not acceptable that we should not have protected embryo and fetal. We have no embryonic and fetal protection. So we should have some kind of more protective standard. There are examples officially of more protective standards. I've cited two here. My recommendation has long been that tritium maximum maximum allowable tritium concentration should be 50 times stronger. And I should tell you that US 20,000 picocuries per liter is more strict than in many other countries, including Canada. Okay, questions?
Yes, thank you so much. So we have a couple questions, and you kind of covered one of these. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has established a safe level of tritium in nuclear plant air emissions. Is that really a safe level, and are nuclear plant emissions below that level?
Yeah, so the the nuclear plant emissions and discharges to the water are covered by 40 CFR 190. I'll put that in the chat. 40, just a minute. Oh, sorry. Uh, I was leaning over. Uh, my laptop keyboard doesn't work too well, so I have an extra keyboard. Um, 40 CFR 190.10 limits radiation doses to 25 millirem per year. The NRC limit is 100 millirem, but that's from all sources, not just from your neighboring nuclear power plant or your neighboring, uranium hexafluoride plant or whatever. And that limit is 25 millirem to the whole body or to any organ except thyroid, which is 75 millirem. Thyroid, of course, is targeted primarily by iodine. And n- so, yes, Commission has established safe levels of tritium. I mean, the safe level is established by the EPA in the drinking water standard. The drinking water standard is the references in my book. It's 40 CFR something. 40 CFR is the EPA standards. Um, and so it's the 20,000 picocuries per liter is part of the EPA limit. And generally, as I said, the dose would be much lower if it were at that limit. Generally, nuclear power plant discharges into water bodies do occur, and they are generally well below 1,000 picocuries per liter. Sometimes they may be in the tens of picocuries per liter or hundreds of picocuries per liter. So generally, they are within the regulatory limits, but water bodies don't always have contamination to less than the limit I would like to see, which is 400 picocuries per liter. That's the California guideline, 500 picocuries per liter. So radiation protection is preempted by the federal government under the 1954 Atomic Energy Act. And so states cannot set their own standards, but they can have guidelines. And like New Mexico has a guideline um, for water downstream of Los Alamos, which is 4,000 picocuries per liter. If I'm remembering, I was involved in that in testifying when they were considering that. I don't remember the exact number. It's on our website. You can find all the testimony there. So yes, there is no safe level of radiation exposure. That is the generally accepted science. The most recent science is published by the National Academy in the US in 2006, called the seventh report of the Committee of the Biological, examining biological effects of ionizing radiation. It's often called the Beer 7 report, BEIR. Let me just get that. Oh, BEIR. Sorry, I'm kind of leaning over, so you have to excuse this. Brianna, will you correct it when you put up the chat, or can you correct it?
Yes.
Let me do it right. Okay, Beer 7 report. And 2006. And we also have a report on our website called Science for the Vulnerable. May I send you a few links? So there are radiation protection regulations. So that's the EPA 40 CFR 190. Then there are drinking water standards where the 20,000 picocuries per liter comes from. There's the Clean Air Act limits 10 millirem per year to the most exposed person. So when I say most exposed person, that's not the language. It says to any member of the public. So the most exposed person should not have more than 10 millirems. So everybody has less than that. And there are also measurement regulations. So, where all those numbers come from is power plants are required to measure their emissions. You may have questions about how they do it and how the density of measurements and all that. And after TMI, that became an issue. But yeah, so the second question, there are no CO2 emissions from nuclear power plants. So nuclear power plants everything has CO2 emissions so long as there are fossil fuels in the economy. So nuclear power plants' CO2 emissions don't arise from normal operation during the operation of the power plant. So the energy comes from fission. Fission does not produce CO2 emissions. The CO2 emissions associated with nuclear power plants are from two types of processes. One is building the power plant itself, all the cement, all the steel, all the construction, all the cranes, It's a pretty big enterprise. And then during operation, you need the fuel. So there's uranium mining, there is uranium milling, refining, getting the uranium. Then you have to enrich the uranium. That's a very energy intensive process. And in the US, in the early years, dating back to the Manhattan Project, and then the same was used for power plant enrichment. There were three uranium enrichment plants to increase the proportion of uranium 235, which is the one that gives you the chain reaction, from 0.7% naturally to 3 or 4% or slightly more than 4, typical these days in power plants. And so the gaseous diffusion process, very energy intensive, used to be powered by coal-fired power plants primarily, so a lot of CO2 emissions. But those are all shut, and there's a much more efficient centrifuge process plant in New Mexico, but also, runs off the grid. So there's in New Mexico, so there are CO2 emissions associated with that. But, solar has CO2 emissions, wind has CO2 emissions, and when solar and wind, the big difference is those are only associated with construction. So making the panels, building the, solar farm, wind turbines, so on. So there's, the cement towers and all that holding up the turbines. Generally, it's very important to be accurate about this. So some anti-nuclear activists, they say, oh, nuclear high CO2 emissions. That is not correct. Nuclear is comparable on a life cycle basis generally to wind and solar, large scale solar. Small scale solar could actually have more CO2 emissions because you have the truck coming to your house for 3 megawatts, 3 kilowatts. So I think if you do a thought experiment, and I'm dwelling on this because this is a source of confusion, and I think you know we we don't have a lot of money. We don't have a lot of, we do have, we should have the truth on our side. So this is, nuclear is a low CO2 technology. So when nuclear shuts down, if you don't do it thoughtfully, if you don't plan for it, then you are going to increase CO2 emissions. If you do it thoughtfully, and we did do a study for New Jersey before the Conservation Foundation of New Mexico, I think it was, that commissioned us and another sister institute to do a study, you know, hoping that it could be incorporated into New Jersey policy, and most of it actually was. And in that, there was a debate about what would happen if the New Jersey power plants shut down. And we showed that, CO2 emissions would go up if you didn't plan for it. But because the shutdown was, the license expiry was a few years out, if you built extra wind and solar above your target, climate target, assuming nuclear would be on, then you could achieve your climate targets without and allow nuclear licenses to expire. And so you have to do it thoughtfully. And if you do a thought experiment, suppose you had an all solar economy or an all wind economy or an all nuclear economy, would you have CO2 emissions? And the answer is no. Now, there is a source of CO2 emissions that's kind of hidden in in um, in nuclear, which is the diesel emergency generators. So they're not used except during emergencies, but you have to test that they're working. So whenever the emergency generators system is tested, then you have some CO2 emissions, but they're relatively minor. Nuclear power plants are huge. 1,000 megawatts is the equivalent. So we all are kind of heat engines, we generate about 100 watts of thermal energy just from digesting food and breathing and living and the heart beating and the brain functioning. That's 100 watts. Each large nuclear reactor of 1,000 megawatts generates 3,000 thermal megawatts of energy. That's equivalent to 30 million people. That's how much energy there is in one large nuclear power plant. The same heat as 30 million people. Anyway, other questions? I hope I answered that.
No, that was fantastic. I really appreciate that. Um, And it looks like that is all the questions we have for right now. If anybody has any questions that you didn't get in the chat, feel free to shoot us an email or throw them in the comments section, and we'll get to them afterwards. But otherwise, thank you so much again, Arjun,
You're welcome.
for sharing your time and expertise today, and
Yeah,
just
my
helping us
pleasure.
better understand this. Yes.
Yeah,
And
you're
thank you
welcome.
so much, everybody, for joining us. We hope to see you again next week. And I will put a couple links in the chat. And Arjun, any links or reports that you want to share afterwards, I'll put those in the
Yeah,
comments later
I'll
too.
send you one at least.
Perfect. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Bye bye.
But again, yes,
Yeah,
thank you,
yeah.
everybody.
Bye.